Welcome, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you, Katie, for the invitation. Um, I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey through my background a little bit because that's relevant to VetCompass, but it's also relevant to this word called perspective because we all look at the world through different lenses, and I look at the world through a primary care veterinary lens. And certainly the data we're going to look at today is primary care veterinary. We're going to look at information on rabbits, guinea pigs, and hamsters. Sometimes we call these exotic species or rare species or unique species, but we'll see what the data tells us. And maybe they're not so rare as we might think. The bits we're going to cover is we're going to start with evidence. I'm an epidemiologist now. I didn't used to be. I used to be a first opinion vet, but basically I live in the world of evidence. If there isn't evidence, I struggle to believe much of what I'm told. And the evidence source we're going to look at is VetCompass. So I'll explain this to you. We'll then look at some evidence from VetCompass on rabbits, on guinea pigs and hamsters, mention some species that are coming next. And then hopefully for the last 10 or 15 minutes, you guys will ask some questions. I hope you do anyway, because to be honest, that's often the best bit of any talk is the questions and the answers. So let's start with VetCompass. Every story begins somewhere, and this fine, handsome young chap was me in a former life. So this was me 20 years ago, 25 years ago. I was in general practice for just over 20 years. For the last 12, I had my own small animal practice in London, where I still live. But as I got further and further into my first opinion general practice career, I started to struggle with the evidence we had. And actually, I didn't believe most of it. And there really was huge evidence gaps. And that left me with lots and lots of problems. One option I had was to just continue what kind of I had been doing at the very start of my career, which was say, well, it's a pity there isn't. And oh, well, let's go and have a pint. The second, as you got more experienced, was to go, let's think about that and then make some answers up and look very, very clever because nobody could ever say you were wrong because there was no evidence anyway. And then as the years went by, that became unsatisfactory. So you're left with the choice of either leaving the profession if you just aren't happy with what's going on, or you could move to a different type of veterinary care. Or you could make a huge decision and decide, well, if there's a gap and it's not being filled and the years have been passed, let's just go and do it myself. And that's actually what I decided to do, which is slightly lunatic, but so be it. So I took my first opinion background, and many of you probably work in first opinion practice. And this was my view. My view is that we are part of the most wonderful profession. We have vets and vet nurses and technicians and receptionists, whole veterinary teams. We carry huge amounts of experiences in our heads, and we then transmit those onto our computer systems. And if only we could develop a single system that could capture all of these computerized records from lots and lots of different practices, we could then mine that and answer research questions. And that essentially became the VetCompass philosophy. And that philosophy is that we mine this information to generate evidence, the bit that was missing before, and specifically in relation to animal welfare, because that was the reason I was doing this. Yeah. So conceptually, this is what happened. I left practice, decided to do a PhD at the Royal Veterinary College with Dave Broadbelt, Dave DeChurch, Paul McGreevy, Peter Thompson from the University of Sydney as well, and developed this concept. And I imagined the directions that we needed to go in veterinary, almost like a compass, that it would point us in different directions. And we could almost look at these north, south, east, and west as being my key directions. Number one was welfare and well-being. That was absolutely key. And every VetCompass study must have a stated welfare goal. The second was evidence. It needed to be hard evidence. We needed to get away from the, I think, which is really just making stuff up. And even if I believe the stuff I've made up, that doesn't make it correct. In fact, as I've gone along with VetCompass over the last 15 years, much of what I was making up before and that I did think was correct wasn't. The evidence often shows that it isn't. The N is non-profit. This is absolutely key. And I'm going to try and persuade you later on that you should be developing a VetCompass in Canada. So basically, this is absolutely key to my belief if we're doing one of these systems, because as soon as you get into profit, it becomes murky. And then the final bit is stakeholders. The prior model of research had all been about research by researchers for researchers almost. And we could count the veterinary profession as researchers in one sense. My view is that it should include everybody who's interested in animals, and that especially includes owners. So stakeholders were really important. So this is the model that I had for the veterinary compass. And the idea was that in general practice, I might make a huge difference to a single animal's life. And all of you will make huge differences to single animals' lives. You can save them, you can cut out tumors, you can cure diseases. But as an epidemiologist, even if I make a tiny difference, but to thousands or hundreds of thousands of animals' lives, hopefully I'm having a greater welfare impact than I was in practice. And this is what drove me to leave practice and move into epidemiology. So this is essentially the concept. It's that vet practices record data on the computer systems, and you will be doing the same in your practice in Canada. We collect those data real time. So every day we take downloads of the demography and the clinical notes and the treatments from, you'll see in a minute, hundreds and hundreds of veterinary practices. Those data are reformatted, so they're all in the same format, put into a single database. We then unleash the dogs, which are our researchers, me included, to do the research and then generate the papers and feed them back to the vet practice. And this is a very important loop, and essentially it's what I'm doing here, because I'm going to tell you about results of rabbits and hamsters and guinea pigs. But the much greater impact, welfare impact, comes from influencing other stakeholders. And that means they say the government, the big charities, the Kennel Club, if we're interested in dogs. But the key power holders, power brokers here are owners. Owners decide which animals to get, how to look after them, whether to bring them to the vet, whether to do your treatment, and even when to allow you to euthanize. So we do a lot of outreach to the general public. So this is the model. Where are we now in the UK? This island here is England down here, Wales here, Scotland here, Northern Ireland. I come from just over here, by the way, little town called Tipperary in Southern Ireland. But this is VetCompass in the UK. I live here in London, just here. And currently in the UK, we have about a quarter of all veterinary practices feeding us in data from first opinion, referral, charity care, and emergency care. That gives us about 29 million animals so far, 350 million clinical notes, and 800 million treatments. So these databases become very big, very fast, and you can pretty well answer the majority of questions that primary care vets and vet nurses need. I Googled this earlier. This is your country. And as far as I'm aware, this is where you are. And my suggestion to you, I'm going to keep suggesting as we go along things you should remember, but I think you should have a VetCompass set up in Canada, or at least start with one in Prince Edward Island. But you can chat about that with me at the end. I said it's a good source of evidence. How good? Well, this is the output of papers. And this was my PhD. I started 2010. The first paper came out 2012. And we've been steadily increasing. And we're topping out now at about 15 a year. So that means we're getting more than one paper every month. And this is wonderful. So over 150 VetCompass alone. Obviously, there's lots of other research programs I work on as well. So there's more papers than that. Species is pretty well anything that walks through the door of veterinary practice. So dogs, cats, dogs are my mainstay, mainly because of what humanity has done to them by creating extreme conformation. We're going to come back to that in a minute with rabbits. But pretty well any species that vets care for, there will be data in a VetCompass program, and that means we can do research on it. So these are the species we've published on so far. And I've put these three in red, rabbits, guinea pigs, and hamsters, because that's what we're going to talk about today. So that is VetCompass. Take a breath. And I hope at the end, some of you will chat with me or maybe later on or come back from the university. But I think there's huge potential for this in Canada. We have set up VetCompass in Australia. We have set it up in Singapore, and Southern Ireland is just about to start. And there's a bunch of other countries that are in the process of working up to it. So there's no reason why you can't do it there. Right. Let's move to the first of our three species, so rabbits. Then we look at guinea pigs and then look at hamsters. So rabbits first. If we're going to look at these species, probably from VetCompass, even before we look at the individual species one by one, is to look at the big picture. Big picture is really important. I said at the start that certainly in the UK, we still call rabbits, hamsters, guinea pigs, snakes, gerbils, budgies, whatever. We call them exotic species. It's almost as if there's two companion animal species, dogs and cats, and then there's the rest, and the rest are the weird and wonderful. Well, let's see what the numbers say. So this is 2003, the most recent data set I've been working on. There was 3.8 million animals in VetCompass under care in 2023. And if we turn these numbers into this is like a donut pie chart. So we can see the vast majority of animals that vets look after are either dogs or cats, about 60% dogs and about 30% cats. But these other species aren't quite as rare as you might think. So 3% of the veterinary caseload is rabbits, 1% is guinea pigs, and a half is hamsters. So these ones here do make up quite a sizable component. So as a veterinary surgeon or veterinary nurse, or as a student going into those professions, these are important species to think about and be aware of. And certainly the client who brings in one of these animals will be extremely bonded to that animal. So to them, it's their entire world. So it does behove us to know a little bit about them. So rabbits, what's the issue with them? Well, in the UK, they're the third most popular pet. Obviously, I've just shown you the numbers, 3%. Traditionally, certainly when I first graduated, 1987, I graduated from Dublin, these were the standard children's pet. They were kind of a disposable pet. You got them, you didn't have to do much with them. You put them in a hutch, there was very little work. This was the image that there was of them. Very, very cute, wouldn't live very long, wouldn't cost very much, minimum effort. But we're now starting to see that there's huge welfare problems with that view. These rabbits, they're domestic descendants, so we have domesticated them, but they're still, in essence, largely similar to their wild prey predecessors. So these are alert and timid. They startle easily. Their behaviors still tend to be fight or flight. And really, we're now starting to realize they're not particularly good as pets for children. The children might love them and might get allured into them by TV and film and cartoons, certainly when I was a child, with Bugs Bunny. But the animals themselves are very fragile. They're ground dwellers. They don't really want to be picked up anyway off the ground. They can bite, so they can harm the children when they're hurt or frightened, and they're very easily scared. So there's kind of a move now away from these being children's pets and towards being adults' pets, pets of adults, and often being kept in the house rather than outside in a garden, in a hutch. So things are moving, but there's still probably quite a lot of issues that we have to deal with when we're dealing with rabbits as pets. I often think about the world we have. We think about what we as humans want. We want to domesticate animals. We want them to be our pets. But if we flip it and look at it from the animal's point of view, you can often see a very different world. So we can take animals that are wild and then we domesticate them. And you kind of think, if I was this rabbit, which one would I rather be? And, it's really, really complex when we look at it. If we try to really push this and look at it from the welfare perspective, there's a lot of different models measuring welfare and helping us understand welfare. But one of the big ones is the 5 welfare needs. And we can look at this and say, well, number one, health. And you could argue maybe that this animal here, the caged animal, might be healthier. So in other words, the wild animal might get predated on. The typical lifespan of a wild rabbit is 2 years, so they don't really live that long, but they mature early and they breed very, very fast. So nature has evolutionarily dealt with that short lifespan. But we can keep this animal as a pet, and we can protect it from predation and protect it from injury, and we can vaccinate it, and we can keep the animal very healthy. So you could argue the caged or the pet animal is healthier, but the other welfare needs include behavior. So these animals have natural behaviors. They want to run, jink, play. Um, a lot of the pet animals struggle to do that. Animals, either some want to be alone or some want to be kept with other animals of their own species. So rabbits and guinea pigs are sociable, whereas hamsters are solitary. Again, the caged, the captive animal has lost its power to choose for itself. So we're forcing companionship or depriving companionship in the case of rabbits and guinea pigs at our whim. Diet, these wild animals are eating grass or dead grass, which we call hay. But as humans, we don't like that. We like to see them eat different sorts of food. So we might give them muesli diets, which can lead on to dental problems. And the environment, these wild animals, and have lots of room to run and play and enjoy their lives. As a captive animal, they don't often have that. So we can see it's complex. They might be physically healthier, but maybe behaviorally, companionship-wise, diet-wise, and environmental-wise, these animals have a lesser lifespan. So let's have a look at some data, and we'll see if there's any clues on this. I often think that as vets, we do look at the world from a medical perspective. The expression is a medical gaze. We look at animals and we medicalize their problems in terms of what we can diagnose. And sometimes we miss the bigger picture. We'll come back to this in a second when we talk about innate health. And sometimes we can look at this animal in a cage and medicalize it and see that it's physically healthy. But there's a bit more to having a full life than just being physically healthy. So let's look at some data here. We'll do this for each of the three species. We're going to look at some papers. So one paper for each species. These are VetCompass papers. Often this is an undergrad student. I use a lot of undergrad students in the research. Wonderful education for them. And the undergrad students are an absolute pleasure to work with. Remember, in the background, it's the welfare needs we're interested in. Obviously, we're looking at disorders with health, but we might get clues about these as well. How do VetCompass studies work? Well, essentially, we start off with a denominator, an underlying number of animals. And, that could be 100 animals, 1,000, 10,000, a million. The current population of dogs in the current denominator is 2.3 million. So the numbers can get very large. And we can do 4 types of studies. I've put them in blue. So from the basic animals, we can look at their demography. So their breed, their sex, their age, their body weight. We can then randomly subset and then examine the disorders. Now, the reason we do this is that this is done manually. It's done by manually reading the clinical records. So you can't do that on millions of animals, whereas you can work out the breed and the age on millions of animals. It's just a little bit of computing. So on the random subsets, we can pull all the disorders and we can group them into very precise levels or into larger groups. So we might have lots of different types of skin disease and we can group them into just skin disease, or lots of different types of GI diseases and we can group them into enteropathies. And from that, we can do studies on the most frequent disorders. And we can also pick out the ones that animals died of and do a mortality study, see how long they lived and what they died of. And then we can either subdivide the population. In this case, we're going to look at rabbits and look at them as LOP or non-LOP. So we can subdivide them and do a risk factor study. Or we could pick a single disorder in here and do a risk factor study. And we will always try to do multivariable methods. This means we're accounting for other differences between these different groups. So this is the model, standard VetCompass model. In this particular study on rabbits, that's what we did. We had 162,000 rabbits in the study. And from that, we could study the demography, what proportion were LOPs, for example. We then randomly subsample just under 4,000 rabbits, identify all their disorders, and we're going to look at the most frequent disorders and how long they lived. And we're interested in LOP versus non-LOP, or brachy versus non-brachy, often male versus female. And we will do analyses on that. So that's what we're going to look at. So demography, what do we think? So the thing I said to you earlier was breed. I'm very interested in breed, not particularly because breed itself is interesting, but because of the variation between breeds. Now, here we've taken a wild species, and when we look at the animals, this is what we're seeing with the breeds. We're seeing lots of breeds. So if we highlight this box here, we have about 42% that are crossbreed or just called rabbit. So that means 60% of rabbits are recorded as being of a specific breed. So we've taken a wild species that looks like a wild animal and we've changed it to look like something else. So in other words, something that isn't a typical rabbit. Yeah, it's less rabbit than the wild rabbit. And the risk with that is that the changes we've made have caused health issues. So these might look very cute, and provided there's no health problems, that's fine. Yeah. And that's what we end up using our data to look at. And certainly when we look at dogs, there are lots of breeds with conformations like really flat faces or no tails or lots of skin folds that we now know are detrimental to their health. So that's what we're going to look at here. Is being a lop detrimental to your health? Is being brachycephalic detrimental to your health? What really are the drivers of the big problems in rabbits? But we can see breed is very common. We look at that afterwards. When we look at cats, for example, it's about 80% of cats are not of a breed. They're just a cat, a muggy. So we can see we really have pushed for breed in rabbits. When we look at the animals that we have some breed information on, it's about half of them we have some breed information on, and about half of them are lop. So we can see as humans, we've fallen in love with lop. This is a bit like brachy in dogs, where we have French bulldogs and pugs and English bulldogs. About a quarter of all dogs are brachycephalic. You know, this is something that doesn't happen in nature. If there is a health issue associated with it, it's numerically a huge problem. So again, if there's a health issue associated with this, that's a huge problem numerically. And when we look at skull shape, we can see the majority of pet rabbits are brachycephalic. So flat-faced. Brachy means fat. Flat. Mesati means kind of medium. Some people call it mesocephalic. And dolicho means long, long-headed. People don't like that. They don't particularly like it in dogs either. Flat-faced dogs are much more popular. Yeah? So most rabbits are flat-faced, and about half of the ones that we have breed information on are lop-eared. Why does this matter? Well, this is the second concept I'm going to sell you on, and this is a concept that I've been developing for the last 10 to 15 years, and I'm now starting to promote this through a number of international and national groups, right? And this is something you may not have come across, so this will be something that might be of interest to you, right? If we look at this dog, how would you know it was healthy? Right. So if you're a veterinary surgeon or a veterinary nurse or a veterinary student, how would you know it was healthy? In other words, define health in the first place and then apply it to this dog, right? Now, I've done this for several years now as I've been developing this concept, and this is the majority of the responses I get, that health is about the absence of disease or infirmity. So long as we don't have disease or we don't have infirmity, then we're healthy, right? Now, that probably does apply to humans, and this certainly pretty much is the definition of health that the World Health Organization gives for humans. It also includes behavioral health, but we can argue that's a disease as well. So this probably applies to humans, but it doesn't really work in animals because this animal here may not have a corneal ulcer. It may not have breathing problems, severe breathing problems yet. It may not have slipped its disc. It may not have fractured its elbow. It may not have active skin fold dermatitis. And if it doesn't yet have those issues, we have to say that this animal is healthy under the current veterinary medical model. And I find that completely unsatisfactory because we know that there is an issue with this animal. So I've developed a second concept, and this is called innate health. And innate health is different to this thing about disease-based health. Innate health is whether the animal has the capacity, physical, genetic capacity to have complete well-being. And if we now look at this dog, even if it doesn't have a corneal ulcer or it doesn't have skin folds or it doesn't yet have severe breathing problems, BOAS, or it hasn't yet slipped its disc or it hasn't yet fractured its elbow or a host of other predispositions in this type of animal with this type of conformation, it has a very much increased probability of those diseases. This animal does not have the capacity for complete well-being. It cannot bend its spine. It has not got a tail to wag. Its breathing will be deficient. Otherwise, we wouldn't have 10 million years of evolution giving us nostrils that come out to here. Therefore, we in innate health know this animal is not innately healthy. Whereas in the classic model of health, we have to say that it's healthy if it hasn't got disease. And that's really what innate health is. It's a concept. I'm going to try and sell this to you, and then we're going to look at it in rabbits. And essentially, this is the definition I've come up with. And it's that every animal, regardless of type and breed, should be able to perform all the typical activities for their well-being within the anatomical, physiological, and behaviorally evolutionary norms for that species and its stage of life. So in other words, a dog should be a dog and able to do everything a dog should be able to do. A rabbit should be a rabbit and be able to do everything a rabbit should be able to do. And what are these functions? They're actually so obvious, it baffles me that we've accepted the previous model without actually challenging it for the last 50, 100 years. A dog should be able to breathe and blink and maintain its body temperature and move and eat and hear and reproduce and communicate. And if we cannot do these, we haven't got good innate health. And any conformation that stops you doing any of these then becomes an extreme conformation. And again, I've defined this, I've put this through the international collaboration. An extreme conformation is any body shape that is so significantly altered by humankind away from the natural, and here I'm talking about dogs because it's the extreme conformation group for dogs, but this could be rabbits, so far away from the natural conformation that they commonly suffer from poor health and welfare. So in other words, variation is fine. We're domesticating animals. We're going to change them. That's fine, so long as there isn't a health and welfare cost to the animal. And unfortunately, for a lot of breeds, dog breeds, there are. And certainly when it comes to dogs, this is the message from the International Collaborative that everyone should stop and think before acquiring an animal with extreme conformation. Because by definition, extreme conformation means that these animals commonly suffer from poor health and welfare. So why on earth would we bring an animal into our individual lives and also bring more animals into the world existing that we know are predisposed to disease? So that's the concept. Why does it matter to rabbits? Well, because we're just coming up with these breeds and we're inventing them now and we're popularizing them. And if there is evidence that LOP is associated with health problems, then this typical conformation as we change to LOP, it is exaggerated. We know that. The question is it extreme? And that's what the data are going to do. So let's look at data for these species, and then we'll whip through guinea pigs and rabbits similarly. Top disorders in rabbits. Well, until VetCompass came along, we didn't know this. Isn't it amazing? This was the stuff that was driving me nuts in veterinary practice. The most common problem in rabbits is overgrown nails. Second most common, overgrown back teeth, and obesity, and then kind of impacted bums, anorexia, gastrointestinal. And these are the numbers, the percentages. So a quarter of all rabbits under veterinary care need their nails trimmed once a year, at least once a year, often several times a year. If we look at this, we can say animals in the wild shouldn't need their nails trimmed. So this suggests these animals aren't getting enough exercise, or their bedding, the substrate isn't abrasive enough. Their teeth shouldn't be overgrowing. This suggests there are issues with diet. Obesity, they should certainly not be obese. And the wild animals aren't going to survive very long if they're obese. And perineal fecal impaction, it's a combination of multiple different issues. But again, it shouldn't be happening. And often leads on to myiasis, onto maggots. So huge problems. I'm often interested in sub-questions like male versus female. These are p-values. Any p-value less than 0.5 suggests there's a difference. And this one kind of surprised me, that there seemed to be a male predisposition to dental problems. And I've actually looked at it in some further studies, and it comes out in all the further studies as well. It's quite an interesting one. And we see it here again with the incisors, as well as up here with the molars. And we see it with conjunctivitis and with ocular discharge, which often are linked to dental problems in rabbits. So it's just an interesting one. These are the ages, median ages of the animals with these conditions. And again, we can see some conditions tend to happen when animals are younger. These are probably related to neutering. And some conditions seem to be happening when animals are a lot older. I said we would look at brachy and then we look at lop ears. So if we look at brachy, first of all, the ones where the brachy animals are predisposed, I've put in red, and the ones where the brachy animals are protected. In other words, they're less likely to get the problem, I've put in blue. And we can see there's equal numbers in either direction. And for most of the disorders, there's no statistical difference. So this suggests there really isn't any evidence here saying that brachy is much of a risk factor for worsening the disease levels in rabbits. And then likewise, dolicho, there was only one disorder that differed between them. So the skull shape doesn't seem to make a lot of difference. And that's different to dogs. And when we look at lops, again, most of the disorders, there isn't much of a difference, but there is three that differ. And all of those three, the lop had an increased risk. This is for perineal fecal impaction, for tear duct problems, and for Shilletiella, mite infestation. So there is some evidence for increased disease in lops, but no evidence for increased disease in brachy. Mortality, often how long a species lives or a group of animals lives, or humans for that case, is a good measure of overall health. Well, here's your second, maybe third little stat if you want to remember one. The median age at death of rabbits under veterinary care is 5. I said earlier in that wild rabbits, the evidence suggests that the median survival is about 2. So the domestic rabbits do live longer. The welfare question is whether living longer is good from a welfare point of view. Because if you're living longer, but you're miserable because 4 of your 5 welfare needs are not being met, yeah, this is the complex question we have. Is that actually good? And maybe it suggests we should be doing more to protect those animals. Median age of death didn't vary between males and females. It did not vary between skull shape. But it did vary between ear carriage. So the erect ears ones did live longer. So again, there is some evidence that lop is associated with some welfare issues. Not huge evidence, but there is some evidence. So it suggests we probably should look a little bit further at this. This is just more of interest. I put in how animals died. About 60% of rabbits under veterinary care died by euthanasia. The other were unassisted. And proportion euthanasia didn't vary between sex, skull shape, or ear carriage. And the causes of death in rabbits, the majority were collapsed enteropathy or brain disorders. And again, there wasn't much difference between males and females. And certainly we can see the collapsed ones, the median age at death was 6. So these are really just old rabbits, really old rabbits, not necessarily any one specific disorder. Every study has limitations. Here we're relying on the owners and the vets to record the breed. It was missing breed information for quite a lot of them. A lot of the disorders weren't fully diagnosed right down to precision. In primary veterinary care, you just need to have enough information to make the animal better. You don't necessarily need a diagnosis. And we were only including rabbits presenting to primary care in the UK. So these disorders might be slightly different in your country, in Canada. And there were other rabbit papers in VetCompass. This is an earlier one, actually. But we've done specific ones looking at dental disease, the epidemiology of it, and then the clinical care of it. And then we had a full paper looking at body weight, standard body weights, and we included rabbits and guinea pigs there. So take a breath. That's rabbits. And again, at the end, we can have a chat about whether you think we as humanity are meeting the welfare needs of rabbits that we keep as pets, and whether the evidence supports that we're meeting their welfare needs, and what we can do about it to make sure that we do meet their welfare needs. So let's look at guinea pigs and hamsters, and then we'll have a little chat at the end. So guinea pigs, first of all. So this same thing. So I'm not going to repeat all the methodology. It's identical. We're looking here at guinea pigs. Guinea pigs are rodents. They're very popular. There's about 1 million of them in the UK. There's lots of different breeds, but actually most owners don't know the breed of the guinea pig. We'll look at the data to see whether that's a justified comment by owners. And again, we're looking at demography, disorders, and mortality, so identical to the rabbit study. Demography, females slightly more common. That often suggests either females are more likely to go to vets, so maybe they have more problems, or genuinely they live longer. The overall weight, another take-home stat for you, if you want to estimate the weight of a guinea pig and you can't actually weigh it, go for 1 kilo. You won't be far wrong. The females are slightly smaller, 0.1 of a kilo smaller. And we do neuter quite a few guinea pigs, but it's mainly the males, 3%. And again, there's a whole study could be done on whether those guinea pigs should be neutered and what the risks are. The breeds. Most people don't know the breed of their guinea pig. Well, actually, the evidence here says most guinea pigs aren't of a breed. 97% were just a guinea pig. And there are some breeds, and there are some fans of these animals, and you can get guinea pig shows, but the majority of guinea pigs are just a guinea pig. And actually, from a welfare perspective, maybe guinea pigs are lucky that we as humanity haven't got stuck into selecting for weird mutations and pushing them in lots of different physical shapes and directions, just like we've done with dogs, like we've done with rabbits, like we're starting to do now with cats. So maybe we should just leave the guinea pig be a guinea pig. And we can see across these breeds, they vary slightly in body weight, but not much. So even the breeds still largely are guinea pigs. They probably just vary in hair coat most of the time. Disorder prevalence, again, similar to the previous study, we took a random sample. The majority of guinea pigs only had one disorder recorded. There was no evidence of any difference in the number of disorders between females and males, which suggests that the overall health doesn't differ that much between the sexes. But primary care vets diagnosed 324 different disorder terms. So this means that even though these are an exotic species and they're only really comprising 1% of our caseload, vets are well capable of diagnosing lots of different disorders, specific distinct disorder terms. And this is great. This is absolutely great. What are the most common disorders? Well, this is very different to rabbits. So the most common disorder was ringworm dermatophytosis, so 6%. The second was corneal ulceration. This may well be linked with burrowing and getting foreign bodies in their eyes, often grass seeds, but corneal ulceration was really common. Then we have other anorexia, some non-specific ones, abscesses, very specific thing in guinea pigs, very specific type of abscess. So we can see the disorders here are quite different. They seem to be less related to husbandry, like a lot of the rabbit ones were related to dental problems, which are dietary, nail problems, which are exercise-based, obesity. So these ones are a different type of disorder. Again, when we look at the males and females, we can see the ones in bold are the ones where there's a difference, and there really isn't that many that are different. I've highlighted a couple, corneal ulceration and foreign bodies, which may well actually be linked anyway, a similar thing, seem to be less common in males. I found that interesting as one I might look at in the future as to why females would be more likely to get corneal ulceration. And again, we can see a range of ages in these disorders. Ringworm happens to be in younger animals. We would expect this. A lot of infectious diseases are more likely in younger animals, and wounds tend to be in younger animals. How long did they live? Well, we said for rabbits, it was 5 years. What's your stat for guinea pigs? In your head, say to yourself the number. What do you think? What's the average age of death of guinea pigs under veterinary care? There's your answer, 4. And these are wonderful stats to be able to give to owners, certainly owners that are thinking of getting these animals, and they might ask you, how long am I likely to have this animal? Or if you're euthanizing a 5-year-old guinea pig belonging to a child, what can you say to that child to make the child feel better? Well, you can give them a stat to say their animal actually lived longer than average. They are such a wonderful owner. Very well done for getting your animal to that age. And this is the sort of information I said I was missing when I was in practice. Females do live longer. So again, if somebody is looking for a guinea pig, they will be able to keep on average for longer. Females are good. And 73% were euthanasia. So this was more than for rabbits. And when it comes to burial, only about half were taken home to be buried. The other half were cremated, and about 14% owners asked for the ashes back, which surprised me. It's quite high, but it does show the bond that people have with their animals. And here we have the causes of death. Anorexia, collapse. We can see most of these are end-stage reasons leading to death. Not much difference. I haven't bolded any except for this one, neoplasia. So not much difference between males and females. And again, we've got a range of ages here. And these are all published in the papers if you want. All the papers are free, open access. Go onto the VetCompass website. We've got a page there with every single paper that we've published. So that's guinea pigs. And then finally, hamsters. I love hamsters. So this was, again, undergraduate student, as there was on the guinea pig paper as well. About 200,000 hamsters in the UK. Often, from a veterinary point of view, they can be difficult to handle. It can be hard to recognize disorders on, but I have to say I love them. This was me in practice, 2004. So about 6 years before I left practice, I wrote this book. Sheila was a client who used to bring in hamsters. She had one particular hamster, this one, Alfie was his name, that she was mad about. And when Alfie died, we decided to write a book on hamsters. It's what you do in practice, isn't it? Not a lot of evidence on hamsters. There's some evidence from some of the laboratory work, but it's hard to extend it onto pet rabbits. So when we published this paper, it was probably one of the only broad all disorder studies published on hamsters. For this study, we had 16,000 hamsters, about half and half male female. So again, it suggests there's no major advantage on one sex over the other. Body weight, we'll come back to this, not quite so easy to say a typical body weight because the hamsters do vary quite a bit, Syrian versus non-Syrian. But if we looked at all hamsters, it's 120 grams. And about 0.5% of the males and the females are neutered, so not that common. But it does happen. These are the species. The majority of hamsters are Syrian or golden hamsters, and they do tend to weigh more. That's what's bringing up the average weight. So really, we shouldn't be saying a typical weight of a hamster. We should be saying a typical weight of a Syrian hamster, or a typical weight of a winter white, or a typical weight of a Roborovsky. So these ones, the Roborovsky's 25, we can say roughly 45 for the other dwarf versions, and then 134 Syrians. And these are handy numbers to have for judging drug dosages. Disorder prevalence, same idea, just under 4,000, same idea as with the guinea pigs. And we didn't really see that much difference. Males and females were similar in their disorder count, and there was slightly higher disorders in Syrians, but it wasn't actually numerically that much different. And again, we had a lot of distinct disorders, so vets are good at diagnosing. The most common disorder in all hamsters, wet tail. Now, wet tail isn't a single disorder. It's a combination of really any reason that an animal could be wet around its rear end. And I suspect not all of these were GI even, because some of them may well be incontinence, but they're still described as wet tail. And this is the top disorder. So again, we're seeing a different pattern to guinea pigs and a different pattern to rabbits. Quite a few bite injuries, but when we separate out the Syrians, we find that the proportion of bite injuries drops because a lot of the smaller hamsters will be kept as groups or kept together, whereas a lot of the Syrians are kept as totally solitary. Nails, teeth, traumatic injuries, often these are injuries from climbing in the cages. And then when we look at mortality, again in your head, what's your typical value? There was a value I used to always quote in practice. It was 1.5 years. I just, to be honest, made it up as the years went by. And it wasn't a million miles out, but it was wrong. Here's the actual number, 1.75 years. So we 5 years guinea pigs, 5 years rabbits, 4 years guinea pigs, and 1.7 years for hamsters. Again, wonderful numbers to quote to clients. The age didn't differ between the different types of hamsters. More of these are euthanized. I suspect a lot of hamsters come to the vet almost because the owners are at the point where they know these animals need to be euthanized. And still 11% are individually cremated, so they get the ashes back. So there is still a strong bond. And this is the causes of death. The highest one, again, is wet tail. And when we look at Syrians and we break out Syrians, it's still the same. Wet tail is still the most common. But we've got a spread of lots of disorders. There's no standout cause of death that's miles above others. But it's useful to know these and to know numbers, and you can cite the paper or even give clients access to the papers so they can help to understand why their animal isn't any evidence that they've done anything wrong. It's just that these things happen as animals get old. Same as before, we said all these studies have limitations. We're counting disorders. We're not taking into account severity. There's lots of disorders not recorded, lots of missing data. And is it representative of all UK hamsters? Well, only of the ones that come to vets. So that's where we come to the end of that broad journey. What species will come next? Well, last week, 2 weeks ago actually, we had a paper published on tortoises. Well, chelonia, but most of them were tortoises with some terrapins and some turtles. So if you're interested in these shelly species, I have two of these, Chloe and Petal. I love these animals. This paper is published and it's open access. And we're doing studies at the moment. I'm in the process of writing these up, looking at ferrets, pet rats, pet gerbils, budgerigars, and snakes. So again, as I said earlier, any species that turn up at the primary veterinary care surgery, we can do studies on, and we are doing studies on. And these are wonderful sources of information. And then over to you guys, and hopefully you will have a chat. You will send in some questions. The plan is that every day should be a learning day, and we should be seeing a new world. We should be looking at rabbits differently, guinea pigs differently, hamsters differently. We should be looking at the possibility of using anonymized veterinary records for research, either in your own practice, just your own practice-based research, or within larger databases like VetCompass. Remember, rabbits, 5 years, guinea pigs, 4 years, hamsters, 1.75 years. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention. I really would like to acknowledge all the researchers and students within VetCompass and the practices who share data. Dave Broadbelt, David Church, Noel Kennedy, Rowena Packer, who I work very closely with, our funders, and most especially all of you guys out there who actually are the ones doing the work at the coalface, helping animals. So thank you very much for your attention. And back over to you, Katie.
Well, thank you so much for that. That was a lot of information, but super useful and practical information that I think I'm now going to remember how long these different species live. So that's awesome. As we wait for questions to come, I wrote down a couple. So someone already asked. So let's get to the group's questions, and then I have some also to add on. So besides VIN, is there another resource for vets to refer to for exotic medical care in practice?
That's a very good question because certainly when I was in practice, I started doing a certificate. I've done quite a few certificates, but I started doing one in exotics. A lot of the exotic stuff was referral or semi-referral for sources of information. There is VIN, there is experts. We now have the VetCompass papers that are published, but probably still VIN is probably still one of the best ones. Obviously, there is exotic formularies for drugs as well.
I have a question about the early statistics you showed on the sort of numbers of the different animals coming into clinics. And one of the things we've talked about over the last couple webinars is just how in Canada, there's not a lot of veterinary clinics that take these species. So is that the case in the UK as well? And if so, do you think these numbers are underestimated essentially of how many rabbits and gerbils and hamsters there are? They're just not being brought to vet clinics in the UK. What's your sense of that?
It's actually a very good question. The norms of veterinary practice do seem to vary between the countries. And certainly we've set up VetCompass in Australia. We're just launching now. We've got all the data launching in Singapore and starting in Ireland. And I expect to see big differences between them. In the UK, most clients seem to have a veterinary practice and they go to that veterinary practice. They don't seem to swap around between different veterinary practices within the one animal, and they often bring all their animals to the same practice. So we don't see that so much. There are some specialist referral centres for exotics, but they just tend to get referrals from primary care. That being said, there are some veterinary practices where they're kind of known that they like exotics. I had a small two-vet small animal practice. I liked exotics, so I used to see lots of hamsters, lots of budgies, lots of chickens that, the chickens that were 2 or 3 kept in a backyard. Other practices around used to then send them to me. And this is the beauty of VetCompass, where we have so many practices feeding us in data that even if we have some practices that don't like exotics and then other practices that do, we're still getting the cumulative same number of animals to us. So in a way, we're taking that into account in our numbers. So I think probably what we are seeing here is in the UK anyway is a very good representative sample of exotic animals under primary veterinary care.
So a follow-up to that question, which I think is highly relevant to our veterinary students, is do you train veterinary students in the curriculum about how to care for these animals, and do you include some of the data from VetCompass into, for example, the Royal Vet College's curriculum?
Yeah, very good question, actually, because certainly when I went through Dublin in 1987, there really wasn't very much on exotics. And you ended up just learning it once you went into practice. And that meant you were just learning it from your colleagues there. So, maybe that was okay, maybe it wasn't okay. In the Royal Veterinary College, we do quite a bit of exotic species training. We're lucky. You'll have seen on some of those papers I had there that we had a name called Joanna Headley on some of them and Vicky Baldry. Well, they're the lecturers on the exotic species course. So that means that these papers become part of the training there. We also, for the students that are particularly interested in exotics, they can do electives just on exotics, which means they get an extra 4 or 8 week block just on exotics. And the ones that are super interested end up doing those studies with me. Do you remember I said in those papers I had an undergrad on each of them? Well, they were the ones that really are interested in exotics that have asked to do these studies with me. And then they're learning by actually doing the research. So there is quite a bit of exotic species training. It's mandatory here. Every vet in the UK has to qualify as being omni-competent. So whether you like it or not, you have to pass your exams on exotics as well as on cattle and sheep and pigs. So in a way, the students have no choice. They certainly have to gain minimum competence. And there is increasing emphasis now being put on husbandry of these species. Certainly on the rabbits, you could even see on the data I was showing there, quite a lot of those disorders are husbandry related. So when I said earlier about the medical gaze, that we medicalize animals, we can see the animal with molar disease as a medical problem, or we can see it as a husbandry problem. In reality, obviously one leads to the other, but it's far better to look at that as a husbandry problem and try and prevent it, or certainly prevent it for the next rabbit that person has.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. We have a couple more questions. So could you expand on the idea that commercial interests are counter to efforts like VetCompass? So for example, why wouldn't corporate clinics be a great source of information gathering?
Really good question, actually. And maybe I didn't explain that properly. So within VetCompass, the majority of our data come from corporate practices. So in the UK, about 60 to 70% of practices currently are corporate. There's about maybe 6, 7, 8 big corporates. And the majority of our data come from corporates. When I had started my PhD, there were fewer corporates back then anyway. It was 2010. And I was starting to recruit practices one by one. And it's quite a lot of work recruiting a practice and pulling their data and cleaning it and merging it, etc. And I was discovering that if I waited 6 months or 12 months or 2 years, those practices would be bought up by a corporate anyway. It was just what was happening back then. So we currently have the vast majority of our data from corporates. So CVS, IVC, Vets for Pets, Medivet, Companion Care, Vets Now, and also some of the big charities, Dogs Trust and PDSA. So when I said commercial, that wasn't what I meant. What I meant was financial transactions where you were paying practices to give you data, or the flip side, the practices were having to pay to give you their data, because obviously it costs obviously a lot of money to run VetCompass. And it's that angle that I absolutely steered clear of when I was setting up VetCompass, because as soon as you move from an altruistic model where there is no money transfer, the practices are giving us their data because they want to contribute to welfare, and the RVC is running, supporting, underpinning VetCompass because it wants to be part of research and helping welfare. As soon as you move from that model into a financial model, you're on a slippery slope, because then people start to question how much money are they getting, and are they getting enough, and how much money are you going to make, and we want a percentage of the profits, and blah, blah, blah. And it just becomes a mess. So essentially, I just took all of that out of the equation and said there is no money transfer in any direction, and there is no profit that VetCompass can make. Any money that we get, say from charities or even industry that are funding research, goes to run VetCompass and to pay for studentships, but there's no profit. So good question. So certainly we are taking data from the big corporates, and very grateful for it as well.
Excellent. Another question here on euthanasia. So in the stats that you showed, the rabbits and the hamsters seem to have lower euthanasia compared to the gerbils. How does this compare to dogs and cats? And is it harder to tell when a rabbit or hamster is suffering?
Yeah, it's a good question, actually, because euthanasia is an interesting one. Again, huge cultural differences. So we have some countries that we've started working with where the culture is that animals will not be euthanized. So countries like some of the Asian countries, Hong Kong. So huge cultural differences. The euthanasia itself, and certainly it's something I'm working on in the UK, we as a veterinary profession do need to promote it and explain it more as a welfare option. Certainly, there are lots of animals that are suffering, and that probably have a life, the expression is, that's not worth living, but that do go on living because somebody won't make a decision about euthanasia. And there is still this prevailing belief sometimes that an unassisted or a natural, I hate that word when it comes to death, a natural death is something to be celebrated, whereas euthanasia is somehow a failure. And actually it's the other way around in a lot of cases when animals are suffering. The reason I put up the euthanasia rates is they often help vets in practice. So if you are talking with a client, certainly a client who has children and maybe a hamster or a rabbit or a guinea pig, it helps to be able to explain that actually the majority of these animals that come to vets that die are euthanized, and that is a positive welfare thing when it's needed. So that's why that stat is helpful. And certainly over the years when I've been sharing these kind of the key summary stats with vet practices, these are the feedback I get. Some stats are just really useful to have in your back pocket. From the actual euthanasia point of view, I think a lot of the really small animals, the hamsters, we're seeing the same with gerbils. By the time they come to veterinary practices, sometimes they're just too far gone. And unfortunately, when we look at the ages, a lot of them just genuinely are old. And we can do our medical gaze and put a medical diagnosis on it. But the bottom line is these are animals that are just old and coming to the end of their life. And, there has to be the final reason why the animal will get euthanasia, but ultimately it's almost something to be celebrated. We've had an animal who's had a wonderful life. Now it is old, it is suffering, and we can prevent the animal from suffering. So it's more providing stats so that vets have something to explain to their owners that actually this is fine numerically.